Hello, and welcome to the third video of introduction video of today, and it's a little bit of a throwback. It's a little bit of a throwback because it's going back to the introduction, the topic I did a couple of weeks ago as a thank you for those people who had enabled me to get to 4,000 subscribers, which I'm very happy to be still above. Last I checked, roughly 4,140. So thank you very much. I honestly never expected to get this high, so thank you. I've actually been asked the question, what will I do as a thank you when I get to 6,000 or 8,000 or 10,000? And I was sort of going, well, I'll look forward to that, but honestly, I will plan those more when I get there. I have already said, though, that if I get to 40,000, I'm going to do an examination of the Warhammer 40k fleets, because that only seems fair and fits up with getting to 40,000. Come on. Anyway, and it would be funny for a naval historian to be going through it. Especially as I actually do know a little bit about Warhammer 40k. Anyway, leaving it to one side. There is a current debate going on in Britain about the new integrated review and everything that's going on. And I have a slightly different take than some people on it. But I also think it needs to be looked at and thought about. And I think there are some things being missed. And so that's what I'm going to do about that. So in many ways, this is actually more from my bilge pump side of my work than it is from what I do on YouTube as a rule. So this is more of this bilge pumps stuff I do. My PhD is in war studies. It was in the war studies department at King's College London. So I'm familiar with the current debate. I'm interested in the current debate, and I do take an active part in the current debate whenever I get the chance. And on this occasion, I'm getting involved because I'm seeing the same things happening again and again and again. And there's always the hope that someone higher up the food chain will say something, but they don't. So then it becomes, okay, so I'm saying something even though I'm pretty darn insignificant. And I am probably shouting at the wind, and I'm possibly wasting my time, energy, and breath. But do I care about it enough to say something? Yes, so I'm still going to say something. So, the criteria used for today. I've basically taken the criteria used from the Dream Fleet, which, if you want to see, is in a link below. And I'm starting with the current threats and interests, projected likely budget, and options suggested must be reasonable. Okay. So, the reality of Britain in 2020, and some of these diagrams are quite old. Some of them come from The Guardian in 2011. And we've been growing since then. Some of them are from the BBC, not that long ago, but still quite old. In terms of these are just some of the deployments around the world that Britain maintains. Those deployments. That's where it is. That's where it's been decided we have a big enough interest, a big enough commitment in an area. We actually need to deploy troops. We actually need to deploy ships. We actually need to deploy aircraft. We actually need to put boots on the ground and in harm's way. And I know I'm including Canada in this, but Canada, you might say it's not in harm's way, but that is a huge exercise area which is critical to maintaining the rest of those deployments. And I would argue Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, those are in harm's way. We might not like to think about it, but those are in harm's way. So, that is Britain's trade breakdown from 9 years ago. Since then, trade has only grown. And the service industries, there's all sorts of things we do around the world. And those are the trade lines we depend upon. Even the ones which don't come to the UK, we depend on them going for our market, for our economy, because we depend so much upon the financial markets, on them working. And those trade lines are lovely. They're physical trade, but also imagine all those lines are data cables under the sea. Information being passed again, because as you'll hear on a bilge pumps, which will probably come out Next Friday, I'm thinking. Yeah, next Friday. Data is critical. The amount of information going around underwater is far more than is going around on satellites. Far, far more. We're talking a ratio of 9 to 1, if not 99% to 1% in terms of goes underwater. And data is critical for the world economy, for your view, for all of us. Those people sharing those cute animal videos on Facebook from America, I wouldn't get them if they weren't for the data cables going underneath the Atlantic. And I like to see my little puppies. I have my own puppy who I like to share videos of occasionally on Facebook and all these things. You know, nicest way. These are good things for keeping the global morale up, but in a more serious way, that data sharing is part of our culture now. It's part of our everyday lives. Without it, or if it gets damaged or hindered, we're in trouble. And we can't presume people are always going to be happy with it, because guess what? It's not even needed to be world wars for nations to tamper with cables. They've tampered with them in peacetime. They've cut them in sort of threats. They've cut them in wartime. They've done all sorts of things. Those data cables matter. You need to worry about them. That's a very physical part of cybersecurity. We always worry about the data and the hacking side, but what happens if someone just cuts all the cables? So, all these three systems are systems which were going to end war as we knew it. Pictured. Nuclear weapons were going to end wars as we knew them. I'm not sure if anyone else has noticed it, but the world hasn't been particularly more peaceful. Well, it was peaceful for a bit, possibly in the Cold War, when everyone was scared stiff of starting off nuclear Armageddon. But since the end of the Cold War, the world has definitely got very much less peaceful. And it honestly wasn't that peaceful during the Cold War. Bombers. They're going to bomb everyone into submission. Again, I don't see air power having made peace more likely. It's raised the likely cost of war, but it's been worked around. Destroyers weren't going to get rid of the battleship of everything. They haven't. I could also put submarines up there. There are so many different systems throughout history. The one thing you can always guarantee is that new systems and new weapons and new methods of killing and hurting each other will come into being. The second thing you can guarantee is that the salespeople for those systems will say they are going to end wars as we know them and change the world fundamentally. The third thing, the third reality, is that often wars don't change, they just grow. You're more likely to add domains and dimensions to war than to get rid of our existing domains and dimensions, because you're still going to need to do some things physically. You're still going to need infantry, you're still going to need warships, you're still going to need aircraft. If you need aircraft around the world and the aircraft to support your infantry and your warships and your tanks as they go around the world, the odds are you're going to need some form of aircraft carrier or some sort of vessel like that. And that's simple. You're going to need it. Because are you always going to be able to guarantee a land base? Can you secure your land base? At least your aircraft carrier moves. But your land base is, of course, easier to repair if it gets hit. There are fors and against them, but also land base is a major commitment to the local government and local nation. A carrier is a major expense to build. It might last you 50, 60 years, but it's still a major cost to build and to operate properly, and you require a task group. There are fors and against in both these things. Do you know what the right solution usually is? To have both. In certain strategic circumstances around the world, it's far more sensible to have a land base. For other scenarios around the world, in a global economy like Britain that depends upon the world, it's more sensible to have an aircraft carrier. Buzzwords you often hear will be synergy, doing more with less. You can't do more with less. Not unless you want to overwork and undermine the troops and the forces you're sending out. Fitted for, not with. This has been going around for a long time. It only works as long as you make sure you've got the stuff to fit the things with sitting in a warehouse somewhere quickly and able to go. And you're able to make those changes around the world. You could do that in the 1920s and 30s with sloops. You could do that with destroyers and other major ships, aircraft carriers, battleships, battle cruisers, all those vessels with light weapons. You could do it. Some of the equipment we're talking about being fitted for, not with, is not light and not small and not quick to fit. Lighter, faster. The world is in love with the precision weapon systems, with the precision of special operations, and they are amazing. But we are starting to see, if you look at the edges around the world, the fact that special operations forces are being used more and more in areas where perhaps they shouldn't be being used, where perhaps it'd be better to be using more medium forces rather than light forces. And when I'm saying medium forces, I'm meaning light units like the Strike Brigade, which Britain is building, the 8x8s, those big APCs, because organic firepower and something solid can be quite useful when you're in a scenario where you might suddenly get overwhelmed, where you can't pick the fight. The thing about special forces is they are light, fast, highly trained, but they pick when they engage. If they can't pick when they engage, if they aren't free to maneuver, if they aren't able to, use their skills to overwhelm the enemy, then they're in trouble. Because the enemy will often be toting a lot more heavier weapons than they are. And that's when you start to get unfortunate things happen, like have been happening in Africa recently. So, what Britain is planning on sending around the world. We're talking about sending around a task force next year based around the Queen Elizabeth class carrier. And this is a lovely, lovely picture which comes off the internet. And so these pictures I'm just checked up to detail, are provided by Water Wings and Crazy Horse and Mishoik and Rifleman. So that's what some of these pictures come from. And okay, so they've come from Twitter. I've just got the picture originally. And so I'm not sure where they came from originally, but there are some authors listed on them, so I'd like to talk about. And this is a very cool force. This is a lovely naval task group. What Britain's planning on sending around the world. And I can understand it. It's a carrier battle group. It's a little short on fighters. But it's a very good carrier battle group to go around the world. The trouble is Britain doesn't turn up around the world that often at these days. Not as much as they used to. So when you do turn up, you need to be sort of rather like the Great White Fleet in the early 1900s and, various other nations. When they do a world tour, you need to turn up with all your assets. So very kindly, one of my lovely people on Discord server, Brock, I put this picture up and asked, could you do some slight modifications? And the modifications were an extra tanker, an extra Albion or Bulwark, and an extra Type 23. Why this? Well, if you consider my dream fleet, I was talking about 2 destroyers and 3 frigates making up a very good, very sensible task group, escort group. Well, in this scenario, you'd be going around the world with an extra tanker, so that would give you more than enough freedom of maneuver to do some really crazy visits if you wanted to, but also do some really interesting exercises with other local nations when you meet them allies who don't necessarily have the auxiliaries and the fleet auxiliary that Britain has. But also, you would be able to take a significant group of Royal Marines with you, and their landing equipment and their heavy equipment. So you would be going around the world showing off a full spectrum task force. Not a task group, but a full spectrum task force. With the ability to, if necessary, siphon off ships and escort to go off with Bulwark or Albion, whichever one is available, and carry out a landing, do some amphibious ops. Really make a show of strength. At the moment, we're in a scenario where Britain is making several heated exchanges with China over Hong Kong. And yes, we don't want to fight a war over Hong Kong. I'm sorry, I have a great respect for the people of Hong Kong, but Britain doesn't want to go to war at the moment with China. If it can, if anything can be done to avoid it in any scenario, no one wants to war if they can avoid it. If you go around the world with a very few F-35s, and as it stands, we might not have that many F-35s on Queen Elizabeth, that looks slightly less capable than it could do. But if you are taking 14 F-35s, a whole load of regular Merlins, a whole load of Commando Merlins, and a whole load of Marines in an LPD, perhaps with some army units, perhaps with Ajax and Boxer along vehicles along, if they can be as well, from the nascent strike brigades. You are going around the world showing Britain is here. Britain is very capable of reaching you. We can bring all our equipment with us. So please, play nicely, be our friend. And to our friends, it's saying, when we turn up, we might not turn up that often, but when we turn up with the full spectrum. Because we can. Because we're one of very few nations in the world which maintains it. And it's why we have a spot on the United Nations Security Council, and why we have a spot in other things in the world when it comes to making a decision. These positions, by the way, are of huge advantage to Britain in terms of its diplomatic and its global trading strength. They are positions which come with a responsibility, though. They are not just a status symbol, they are a responsibility. And the responsibility is you have to have the capabilities to stand up to it. But that is rather a lot of stuff I'm talking about. So what are the options? Okay. Traditionally, you have the option put forward when we're talking about Britain and we're talking about defence as being all or nothing. Whenever you're talking about the strength of the army, you're hearing about the regulars. Whenever you talk about the strength of the navy, you hear about the regulars. No, there is no point at which people go, well, hang on, maybe we don't need to use this equipment so often, but instead of getting rid of it because that's stupid, we shouldn't put it in reserve. We should give it to the reservists and have properly formed up functional reservist formations. Case in point. I could be talking about tanks, I could be talking about anything, but I'm going to talk about P8s. Britain needs more than 8. We do. But that's the number we can man in regular and afford to and keep it running. But actually, with that infrastructure you've got in place for those 8, you could probably keep another 8 aircraft going without much more expenditure. But you don't want to crew them. But the thing is, the P8 is based off a very commercial, very standard use airliner. In other words, there is a huge number of people who are trained to fly that airliner in British society. Now, I know airlines are very protective of their pilots and their air crews. But I'm also sure that they would quite like the idea that the government takes on a share of their training, of the burden of training them, and those pilots get to go and get some more hours logging up, flying for the nation as reservists. So they can be called up if there is a major war, so we can have more air groups. We can have more aircraft available. If you take the Navy, We're all very worried about the escort strength of the Royal Navy. We're all very worried about patrol boat strength. We're all very worried about minesweepers. Now, the mine clearance divers are already incredible number of reservists involved in them. Why can't we make some minesweepers flotillas reservists? Yes, it would have to change. Yes, the structure of reserves as we have them now would have to change. They would have to grow, and yes, they would have to take on far more duties. And yes, we haven't done that in a long while. And when it was being done last, it wasn't being done perhaps in the best way, and there were issues with it. But we have to have a grown-up conversation about this, because all or nothing doesn't work for Britain. I'm wearing a Falklands War t-shirt today. And I'm not wearing this because of some randomness. When I was deciding to record this yesterday, I actually went and dug this t-shirt out. Made sure it's washed and cleaned. You don't pick wars. Especially not the wars which are hardest to fight. They pick you. They happen when you least want them. When you can't spur up this stuff. Ships take years to build now. Armored vehicle programs take years to run. Capabilities take years to generate. Capabilities which can save lives, which can keep people alive. The problem is we keep thinking all or nothing. And if you can't be a superpower, you have to be a minor power with nothing. You don't. You can afford to be a power which leans more on its reserves. We have a nation which volunteers every time there is a crisis. We have a nation which is full in the UK. We are very lucky with this. We have a nation which will stand up and be counted more often than not, which are prepared to protest for things they believe in, which are prepared to volunteer for their NHS, volunteer for Olympics, volunteer for all these things. I have a bit of experience with the reserves. They are great organizations in the UK from all services, and they provide a huge amount of training and a huge amount of bonus. Plus, they provide a very real link between the armed forces and the nation's civilian community, the nation's population. A very real, tangible link going on that can allow more people who might not have the time or might not have the ability to leave their homes or change home every couple of years, that you have to possibly in the regulars. Well, they will still want to serve their country, and if there is a major war or if there is a conflict, they will volunteer and go. They'll go to the training. Now, I'm going to get pushback on this one, I know. But I honestly think, in the nicest way, it is better for us to put things into reserve and have reservists grow and man them than to lose capabilities. Because losing the capabilities makes it far more expensive to regenerate if you need to, especially if you need to do it rapidly. Whereas putting the existing capabilities and transferring them to reserves at a measured rate, growing the reserves to man them, maybe keeping a core, a nucleus of regular personnel to make sure these things are, the standards are being kept up in terms of maintenance. These are things we have done in the past and we can do now. In World War II, the vast majority of destroyers the Royal Navy could call on in 1939 were mobilized from reserves. They were as complex machinery as you can imagine at the time, and they were mobilized from reserves. Same with the vast majority of people who came from to all sorts of things within the armed forces. Such a strategy would also enrich the forces with a lot more viewpoints and a lot more points of reference. I'm not arguing for a guard style structure. I'm arguing for the British Reserve structure to be expanded. so that we do not have an all or nothing approach. Then instead of going, we no longer have, instead of trying to make a faux argument, oh, this capability is no longer something we need, we can evolve past it. We all know the truth. In the nicest way, you don't have a real amphibious force if you can't land heavy equipment, and if you don't have the heavy equipment, you might as well not land a proper amphibious force, because they are going to get overwhelmed and they're going to get hurt when they go up against anyone who's even a near peer enemy. But if you're looking at a scenario where you're going to go into that, if you have reservist ships that you can, and crews that you can activate, maybe not on 48 hours alert, but maybe you go, right then, well, we have enough reservist personnel, we have protocols, we can activate this ship with a week's notice perfectly. We can do it, if necessary, in a crash in 3 days. And you also start to give the government an extra lever when it comes to deterrence, because they can go, we're calling up the reserves. This is how serious we are. We are calling up the reserves now. Calm down. Come to the negotiating table. All right. So back to normal talking about. So normal things. 9th of July, Flying Boats and Seaplanes. That's today. Some more admirals, engineers, and historians next Tuesday. Naval diplomacy on the 16th. And 20th of July, Patreon video. CIA's Royal Navy operations in the Indian Ocean from 1941 to 43. From the sea, Korea-Indonesia confrontation. 28th of July, making Mare Nostrum a hollow jest. And 30th of July, pre-tribals. Where else you can find me? Especially if you're going to be complaining about reservists. So, the point I've been trying to make today, and the point I'm trying to make with this is simple. Britain can't afford to be all or nothing. All or nothing leads to salami slicing and in actually cutting of whole areas of equipment which are then more difficult to build up. Arguably, the complete cutting of Harriers and then having to regenerate the F-35 program has made, and the naval aviation has made us far more difficult than if we had gone, right then, what we will do is we will sound up a reserve Harrier squadron. And so we'll have a reserve Harrier squadron going using the spare parts we have and the pilots we have who don't mind being reservists, so core regulars. And then if we need them, we can call on them. We can put them on a carrier. Because then, you wouldn't have ever had anyone claiming you have a carrier with no planes, because you could have stuck some Harriers on there. And you could even be doing now, sort of, if we're talking about this big task of going around, you might have kept the Harrier squadron still going. You might not have. You might not. You might be using short Tucanos instead. Who knows? There's all sorts of options with Tucano, with those various aircraft. But we have to stop thinking in all or nothing, in absolutes. The world is not absolute. It's not black or white. It's not 0 or 1. It's a sea of greys, a blur of greys. And we have to adjust to that now. We've gone through the Cold War period where there was honestly a good reason not to worry so much about reservists, because the idea was the wars would quickly go nuclear, so there'd be no chance to reactivate them or get them in position, so there was no point. It was what you had regulars to matter. We've emerged from the Cold War. We still have nuclear weapons as very much a threat, but the whole grey sphere of operations, all the other things we see going on around the world, to give you an idea that actually, nicest way, wars aren't going to come on quickly if they're major wars, and they probably aren't going to go nuclear very quickly. In fact, hopefully not at all, if everyone's, worried about each other's nuclear umbrella. So reservists start to make sense. It starts to make sense to go, right then, this is a capability we don't need to use that often. About once every 10 to 20 years, we need to use this capability in terms of heaviness. But when we do need it, we need it there. We need it right there, and we need it there immediately. Well, reserve it. Make it a reserve capability. You look at your capabilities and go, what capabilities do we need to use every year? What capabilities do we need to use within every 5-year period, every 10-year period, every 20-year period, every 30-year period? Which of these capabilities are essential? Which of them is so difficult, so complicated that you have to have someone, a specialist, do it all the time to practice a capability? Versus which are ones that if you have a core of regulars, you can actually build a reservist force around and run it through reserves. And that will make things very interesting. Because A, if you're storing and looking after them properly, reserve ships can last a long time and be very useful. B, if you have, let's say, some reserve Type 23s or reserve main battle tanks or reserve whatever, you have a scenario where suddenly you need to use some, and so you can't do another commitment, you can always go, right then, we're going to test out the reserves by activating them. Well, you have to do regular exercises which do allow the reserves to come out and practice their skills and use their skills. But you could even build a land-based ship, which could land ship like we've already built for the Type 45s, and have them practice some of their skills on them. There are all sorts of options for how to do it. But what means is if you do have reserve, if you do have some slack built into the system, and this is what we're talking about, building some slack into the system, using reserves, using a natural pool of available people and growing what is a natural trait in the UK and using it to our advantage, you would have a far less problems long term. Because let's say you do need to pulse ship suddenly to the Strait of Hormuz again to back up the ship already forward deployed out there to deal with some Iranians. So that means you have other missions which are going to have to be done, and you would normally, in the current circumstances, have to start playing around with the maintenance schedule of ships and extending some ships and doing very expensive damage to them. Instead, you might go, well, actually, what we're going to do is we're going to bring online one of the reserve frigates, going to ask the reservists to volunteer, and we're going to have them go and do the cruise somewhere in either maybe the UK's on-call frigate or something like that. One of the lower risk missions. While they're covering that, then that allows us to keep the maintenance schedule still going and keep the ships in good, rest of the fleet in good nick. That's the point. Anyway, I don't want us to turn in a rant, so I'm not going to keep going on. But my idea is very much is that you use the reserves and you start adjusting the forces and you build the forces around the idea of, rather than you either have to have this capability or not have this capability, to we already own this equipment, we already buy this equipment, we use this equipment, but we don't use it that often. So perhaps instead of having it sitting there and having a load of people sitting around who are very much trained but not able to do, not really called on that often, to let them have reservists so that they can be very well trained. And it would require changes to make sure they could be trained, but we don't have to pay their wages the whole time because we only pay them when they're training. And it also acts as a method of closing the gap between the forces and the British public, which sometimes seems to be there. Hopefully isn't there, but sometimes does seem to be there in terms of how people understand how the forces behave and act. Anyway, that's enough for me. Hope it's been helpful, and hope this is. And if you do like these ideas, if you do think they should be part of the integrated review which is going on, please feel free to tweet it at Boris Johnson or whoever. I'll take the flak. Take care and have a nice day.